Let's discuss freezing, which is a trauma response. Hi, my name is Dr. Natalie Jones. I have worked many years as a therapist treating people who have been victims and perpetrators of abuse as well as other types of trauma. And freezing as a trauma response is basically where you shut down or you become immobile when you are triggered by a person's actions or something that they said, or by even by a situation. So this commenter says, I remember seeing the signs in a relationship, knowing that things were wrong, but not knowing what to do or if I should have called it out and addressed it. Some of these behaviors made me freeze mentally. And then she goes on to talk about how she didn't want to seem like a bad person, right? Which is also, there's a freeze/fawn there. And I've done a video on fawning there. So wanting to appease someone who is abusive or toxic, and just sort of be submissive is the word I'm reaching for. I'm like, what? Brain freeze there. But you're wanting to be submissive. But a lot of times, I want to go back to the freezing portion. When we freeze, we are triggered. And when you were triggered, that should be a clue to you, and to your brain that, hey, this is something, this is a behavior, this is a pattern that is familiar to me before. And this is my body's way, this is my brain's way of letting me know that, hey, this is a familiar pattern, and this pattern that I am familiar with did not work out well before, and so maybe I need to change up and do something differently. And so you're sort of triggered by that, but instead of, doing something differently, you freeze, right? Because you're so, you're stressed out, and you don't really know what to do. And so you stay frozen in time for a moment. But, I would invite anyone who experiences freezing due to being triggered, or even a state of functional freeze, where you're just sort of shutting down all the way down. I would invite you to get very curious about that, see what that's about, what's causing that, and then reflect on how you're being affected by that emotionally, physically, the length of time that you're staying in a freeze state, because sometimes people can be stuck in a freeze state for seconds, minutes, hours, but other times people can be in a state of functional freeze for many months on end and not be aware that that's what's going on. When you just kind of you go home and you shut yourself in and you lock the world out and you just essentially stop living, and you have no desire to live or participate in the world around you. And so, yeah, you can go through and see the signs, and that's, that usually comes from the familiarity. And it also can come from being afraid of conflict as well, because, when you change up patterns, when you change up cycles, there is a certain amount of conflict that goes along with that. Like, you have to speak up. You can no longer be invisible and sort of shrink yourself to make yourself small. And a lot of people, again, if they've experienced years of trauma, they've also experienced years of being invisible and being unseen and not having their feelings cared for or respected or valued. And so it's going to be more of a system shock to sort of try to switch that and pivot. Again, as you guys know, I always recommend the help or assistance of a licensed mental health professional when you're doing that. So a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or a licensed therapist can be of assistance with you there. And, learning how to emotionally regulate, being able to identify what your emotions are, because your emotions are signal indicators. And in this case, they can indicate that something is wrong if you find yourself being angry or frustrated or shocked or even saddened. sad, that could be an indicator that something is really, really wrong here. You need to pay attention to whatever it is. But yeah, kudos to you for recognizing that, and just for something to reflect on. If you are around someone that constantly or consistently makes you freeze mentally, I think that may be something, a relationship, that you may want to reevaluate, because again, if that's a pattern that's familiar and that really puts your nervous system in a shock, that's not necessarily a good thing. And so there may be sort of like you may have to go through and reality test yourself as well. Like realistically, you might like a person, you might think that you have fun sometimes, but if that person is always traumatizing or triggering you, they're not necessarily in your best interest to keep around. Thanks so much. And if this was helpful, be sure to share, like, and follow.